Hello guys, welcome to our next video from the Salesforce Dealers team, and in this video we're gonna be looking at what integration is inside of Salesforce and how do we accomplish integration. So integration is generally the common term for the communication of one system to another. So when we say one system to another, so the first system or one system in our case is going to be Salesforce, since that is what we are working with. So if we want to communicate from Salesforce to some other system, for example, it could be a local server-based system like a MySQL server, or it could be another online-based service, online CRM like Microsoft Dynamics or anything else, or it could be anything. It could be a Google-based service, or it could be an accounting service. The important thing is it's not going to be Salesforce. So when we want to talk from Salesforce, you want to send some information or you want to receive some information from outside of Salesforce, that is one system to the another, then that is what is referred to as integration. Now, integration has been a really long running concept. It has been in use by the time we had multiple environments and multiple applications. So the way integration works is we have two independent systems which need to communicate. So the first thing in integration is we need to figure out a common language which is readable and writable by both of these independent systems. So for example, if we want to send some data from Salesforce to a MySQL server, we need to figure out a common language which works with both of these systems, because as you know, the MySQL server, or any third party, maybe it could be written in Java, but Salesforce, Java is not supported. Salesforce, we only support Apex. So since the core languages in both the systems are different, we need to figure out a way to communicate information between both of those. So then the problem came that if we need to communicate between these two systems, we cannot use the Apex or the Java because that is specific to one of these systems. So the solution to this was something called APIs, which you can see right here on our Salesforce Dealers website. So before I move further, like with what APIs are, I just wanted to give you guys a quick reference that anything referenced in this video can be found on our website, salesforcedealers.com, and you should be able to find the integration in Salesforce topic right here. Okay, so coming back to this common language that you're talking about. So this common language or this communication system is called as API, which is the short form for application program interface. So what an API does is it gives a common way for a system to read information or to send information to other systems. And since the API is environment specific, it's written the same way for all of these systems. So the APIs, what they basically do is they provide a way or a common language for the two systems to talk to each other. So the APIs are defined in a particular set of expressions or whatever the syntax may be. That syntax is common between all the systems. So every system just can follow that particular syntax. That is independent of the actual language. Alright, so that is the first 2 points that you have to cover in integration before we go any further. The first point being what is integration. That means integration is the communication between two systems which are independent of each other. For example, Salesforce and Google. Then why do we need integration? That is the second point. We need integration because, again, for an example, your Salesforce works with Apex and all that stuff. And your other system could have its own language, maybe Java, maybe Python. So they cannot communicate directly because they are both based on different languages or different rules. So we need a common language to communicate between them. Then the third point was like, how do we communicate between them? So then the solution for that is something called APIs, which are like a common language which can be read or parsed by any system because they follow a common set of rules and syntax. Okay, so once we are clear with this, then we can move on to the actual syntax or how actual APIs work. So there are two types of APIs which are commonly used with Salesforce or any system in general, and those two types of APIs are your REST APIs and your SOAP APIs. So we're gonna just do a brief introduction to both of them in today's session, one at a time. So the first API that we're going to talk about is your REST API. REST, also known as RESTful API or RESTful Web Services, are based on a representational state transfer, which is a protocol followed in API development to facilitate communication between two systems. So what does this actually mean? So when I say that each API is like a common language and it follows a particular syntax and a set of rules. So REST APIs work off the basis of three main things. First of those things are the REST endpoint, or I mean, I'm not the REST. The first of those three things are the REST endpoint, and the endpoint is nothing but it is a URL, right? So that is the first thing. We'll look into it a little more in next further sessions, but for now, the only thing you need to understand is REST API's syntax or its rules work off three major things. The first thing being an endpoint, which is like a URL. Then the second thing is the REST method. Like so these are the following REST methods that are used, like get, post, put, patch, delete. We'll do a quick example of this earlier, but after this, the third thing is what body or what data you want to send in REST API. So the body, right? So now we know that there are these three things in REST APIs: an endpoint, a REST method, and maybe a body. That's the third thing. So how do these three things allow two systems to communicate? I'll give you a quick example. So let's say I have this Salesforce org open right here. This is our Salesforce org. So let's say this Salesforce system wants to communicate to a MySQL server, right? Which is not based on Salesforce. And we don't even have the login access to that system. We can't even open that system, but still we want to be able to communicate. So what that MySQL system could do with the REST APIs is that MySQL system will give us an endpoint, like which would be a URL. Then that MySQL system will tell us what method, REST method, to send to that URL, to that endpoint. And then it also could tell us what data we want to send to that API, to that endpoint. And that endpoint is actually going to be hosted on the other system than Salesforce, the MySQL server. Then all we need to do to call their functionality is just integrate to that REST endpoint for the MySQL server. We don't need to worry about how that endpoint works on their side or anything. We can just call to it. Now, when I say that there is an endpoint provided by the other system, and then there is a method. So these methods that you see right here, these methods, the get, post, put, patch, delete, these were all defined, to keep the REST APIs easy to understand. So basically, when we are designing any REST APIs, it may be the case where we want to expose some of our own functionality, or we are calling out to any third system, just like the example I mentioned beforehand, where Salesforce could be calling out to MySQL system, and the MySQL system gives us an endpoint. So they are essentially exposing their functionality. So what happens is, if they want their endpoint to be used to read a resource on their side, they'll say that use the get method with our endpoint. So the MySQL guys will tell us that you need to use get with our endpoint because you are reading a resource from our side. That resource could be a row in a table, in a database table, or anything. Then if we want to send something inside to their system and create a new resource, then we'll use the post. Similarly, all of these are different use cases. The put is used when we actually want to update anything on their side. Like there is a row in a table in a database in MySQL and we want to update that particular row by sending a primary key for that row, for example. So we'll need to use the put. Then the patch, quite similar to the put, but it also supports partial updates. What we mean by that is we would be updating like 5 fields in that row and only 3 of those fields are updated, 2 of the fields are not updated. So that's kind of a partial update. It also supports that. And then the last commonly used method is the delete rest method, which is used when we want to delete something from the other third party. So this is the convention. So this is the syntax that is followed by while designing REST APIs. So you will need an endpoint, a method. Now, some of these might want additional data to be sent. So let's take an example of the post. So we have an endpoint. We have the method as post, but we still need to send the actual data to be stored in the table, right? Apart from these two things, because the endpoint is just a URL and the post is just the method. So then we can also send a body with these two things, and that is the third thing, the REST API. And then the external system, the MySQL system, can read that body, fetch information from it, save it into their database. So this is like a really quick high-level overview of how REST APIs work. Now, one thing to keep in mind is currently Salesforce does not support calling out to external systems with the patch methods. What that means is if you want to communicate to an external system, again like that MySQL server from inside of Salesforce, we are going from Salesforce to an outside system. So you cannot currently call out to an endpoint with the patch method because this patch method is not supported into Apex. So we might look into workarounds on this later, but just something to keep in mind. Okay. Also, so when I talk about the 3 points again in REST APIs, the endpoint, the method, and the actual body which is sent. So when you send out a body in the REST API, you can use different data formats. Like you can use the JSON data format or you can use the XML data. So again, these JSON and XML are just data formats which will be looked into detail in future sessions. But for now, the thing you need to keep in mind is that REST APIs work with both JSON and XML type formats. And since REST APIs only communicate everything by using these 3 things only, the endpoint, method, and the actual body in the request, they are a lightweight API. They don't use too much bandwidth or internet usage in order to send out a request and receive a response. Okay, that is it for the REST API. Now let us move forward with the SOAP API. So SOAP, or short form for Simple Objects Access Protocol, this was actually the SOAP was an older model of APIs before REST. And the reason SOAP was an older model is, so in the case of SOAP, you didn't have 3 parameters, but you just have one XML file. Again, XML is a data type format, but there only was one XML file in the case of SOAP APIs, and that XML file had all the information which was required to call out to the other system. What that means is, again, we just talk about, let's say, Salesforce and a third-party system. Let's say this time this is a Java-based system. which is hosted somewhere, maybe on Amazon S3 services, let's say. So, and with that system offers connectivity only by SOAP APIs and not by REST APIs. So what they will do is they will generate this XML file on their side, and this is actually called a WSDL file, WSDL file, or what do we say? And they will generate this file from their side, WSDL file, and that file will contain all the information needed to call their system. That it might have the endpoint, it might have what inputs they receive, it might have what outputs they send back. They generate that file and they'll give that file to us, the Salesforce guys. Then we need to use that file inside from Salesforce, and that file will allow us to call their system directly from Salesforce. But the problem with SOAP was, like with REST, you had just these three things, like the endpoint, the method, and the body, and these were easy to communicate. But as you'll see in future sessions, the SOAP WSDL files, those are really large, really bulky in nature. They could be like MBs in size, they could be thousands of lines. And since that is the case, they are very heavyweight in nature as compared to the REST APIs. And then because of this, we have some little problems when we actually use the SOAP API in Salesforce, because basically how that works is, so you will receive a WSDL file from a third party, from an external system. Then Salesforce allows you to store that WSDL file in your org and generate classes from it, like actual Apex classes. And then you can use those Apex classes to call out to that third-party system. But if the file of the WSDL, if the size of the WSDL file is very large, you have problems generating that Apex class. But so essentially, 99% of the cases, we want to use the REST API if it's possible. And mostly nowadays, every third-party system prefers using REST API, but still, if you have to use the SOAP API, you'll need to keep in mind about things like generating classes from WSDL files and everything. But so again, really small, high-level overview of what SOAP APIs are. Then on our website, you can also check out the differences between these. So REST stands for Representational State Transfer. Then SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol. The reason why it's called Simple Object Access Protocol is because we are just using the WSDL file to directly represent the whole object in our system. So when you actually gonna see the WSDL files in next sessions, they contain information for all the objects in that third party. So that is why it's called Simple Object Access Protocol. Then REST APIs work with multitude of data formats like XML, JSON, simple text, etc. But SOAP only works with the XML type format. REST API, as I mentioned, works with just by exposing an endpoint and an HTTP method like get, put, post. But SOAP only works with WSDL systems. Then again, REST is the lightweight system, SOAP is the heavyweight system. REST requires less bandwidth to use and SOAP requires more bandwidth to use. So simple differences between those. Now, the next thing, this is just specific to Salesforce, which is Salesforce, in order to integrate to any third-party system, you need to tell Salesforce that that is a secure third party, or otherwise Salesforce will not allow you to send any requests to that third party. So what will happen is, let's say I write some code magically in my org to, let's say, send some information to a Google service of some kind. So if you haven't set up the security for that endpoint in Salesforce, Salesforce will not allow you to send information back, and you will see this error pop up, like unauthorized endpoint, please check setup security remote site settings. So what that means is, again, this is our org. If I go to my setup and search for remote site settings, so you'll see remote site settings are the addresses or the endpoints basically to the organizations, which can be called from a salesforce.com. So any third party that you want to call out to, you need to add the endpoint of that third party in here by clicking on new remote site, putting the URL in here, and then saving it. So for example, uh, let's say in the case of REST APIs, that person is gonna give me the endpoint, the REST endpoint, right? And let's say they give me an endpoint like it could be something like HTTPS www www.google.com/API service or something like that. It would be something of this kind. So you just need to put it here, the URL, and you'll just need to add here that your example is Google. You save this out. So you see, it only saves the base URL, like it removed the API service from here. So now what that means is anytime we make an external request to the Google endpoint, it says we're gonna allow sending the request to the Google server, and it's not gonna throw us this error that you see right here. Now in the case of REST APIs, this endpoint is really clear. You can directly just check because the person will give you the endpoint directly, since that is how REST works. But in the case of SOAP, you'll still need to add the remote site settings, but in that case, that person could have only given you that WSDL XML file. So, but you'll find that endpoint URL inside of that WSDL XML file, which you'll see in the example. Next time we do it. So you'll be able to get that URL from there and then just save it out in the remote site settings. And then again, it'll allow you to send requests to the SOAP with that as well. So again, for any references on how to set up remote sites, you can go to our website and check it out. But I think this is it for this session, guys. It was a really high level overview. In the next sessions, we're going to look into detail how to use REST and SOAP APIs from Salesforce. We're going to look into both the things, like how to expose our Salesforce functionality with REST APIs and how to consume other third-party systems APIs from inside Salesforce. So I'll see you guys in the next video.